eliminate any type of excuse or entitlement, and you show up and do the work. Like, that's seriously as simple as it can get.
Welcome to part 2 of the season 2 finale of the Game Changing Attorney podcast. Today, we're continuing our trip down memory lane as we look back at some of the most memorable and insightful conversations from this year. Get ready. It's going to be a wild ride.
Every focus group you do is like a new panel walking in. And as you do more of them, you become more comfortable, you become authentic. And if you're authentic, your charisma shows. And if you have good charisma and you're authentic, you are trustworthy. If people trust you, you do better.
I'm Michael Mogul, founder and CEO of Crisp, the nation's #1 law firm growth company. I've built my business through practice, not theory. Crisp started with just $500 to my name and has grown to over 8 figures in revenue over the last few years, earning a spot on the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing private companies in America. Our approach has been to take everything we've learned about generating massive growth within our own organization and help the country's most ambitious and committed law firm owners do the same for theirs. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with innovative market leaders from the legal industry and beyond to learn from those who thrive in the face of adversity, challenge the status quo, and define what it means to be a true game changer. Today, we're looking back at some of our most iconic guests and the most insightful moments from this year. From the mindset required to perform under pressure to achieving the impossible, this episode has it all.
Being crazy is a compliment. When somebody says you're crazy, that means you see things that other people can't see. Everybody that's done something special in life, they've all been criticized for being crazy. It's a compliment. When somebody says you're crazy, you're nuts, I said, yes, I am.
That's coming up on the Game Changing Attorney podcast. To kick things off, we're revisiting our conversation with 5 times CrossFit Games champion and the fittest man on earth, Matt Fraser. I began our conversation by asking Matt to explain CrossFit to our listeners and why training for the CrossFit Games is unlike any other sport on the planet.
So basically, showing up to a CrossFit competition, it's being prepared for any physical activity, weightlifting, gymnastics movements like pull-ups or ring muscle-ups, handstand push-ups. So weightlifting, gymnastics, running, swimming, biking, odd object like strongman events, powerlifting events, Olympic weightlifting, basically anything physical. The way I always kind of break it down is I could walk into any powerlifting gym and find someone that can out squat me. I can show up to any college track meet and find someone that can outrun me in the mile. So, I'm not trying to squat 600 pounds and I'm not trying to run a 4-minute mile. I'm trying to squat 500 pounds and run a 5-minute mile. And then if you can check off both those boxes, all right, now who can do 30 unbroken muscle ups? Who can swim a 500 meter under a certain time limit, So it's basically just trying to be good at everything and not really excellent at any one specific thing. I'm just trying to be even keel across the board that no matter what you throw at me, I'm going to get through it. We've had events where it's like a 1 rep max squat clean, and you can show up to any probably high level national event, or like you go to the world championships and our clean doesn't really chalk up to what they're doing. But now find one of those guys that can even break an 8-minute mile. And so it's like, I did a squat clean at 380 pounds, but then I'm also running like a 5-minute mile. So you're trying to find the combination of these two things. So, it's just a constant game. There's endless combinations of movements or time domains, and it's just trying to perfect all of them.
So at what point do you essentially decide to go all in on CrossFit, right? To say like, you're not going to go down the route of engineering, you're going to go all in.
So I competed my first, I'd say 2 years at the CrossFit Games. So at the World Championships of CrossFit while I was still a full-time student. And then I graduated. And after I've been to the World Championships twice, I've been on the podium twice, I have enough support from sponsors and, just from prize money at competitions that I was like, okay, I can do all right. Just from the support from sponsors. I know I'm not thriving. I'm not going out and making retirement type money, but I can get by. And I think I was just like, the desk job will always be there. If I want to take a year or two gap between college and work, roll the dice on myself and kind of see what I'm capable of, see if I can make something of this. All right, I'm good. But then, it was just like I graduated college and the job fair was at school, and professors were kind of like, hey, like, what ones are you interested in? Do you want letters of recommendation, anything like that? And I was like, I don't think I'm going to go. And the obvious concerned look of someone that knows, like, hey, you did great in school. This is what you did it for, to get a good job. And then just seeing me be like, nah, I think I'm good. I think I'm going to roll the dice over here. I think that was the moment that I was like, okay, I'm going to give this one honest shot, because after the 2015 season, I came second place for the second time. Huge disappointment. The whole year I was in school. I was trying to have a social life. I was, juggling all these other things, and I wasn't dedicating everything to the sport. I was like, all right, I want to do 1 year where there's no what ifs. I want to do 1 year where it's like, oh, what if I wasn't distracted by a girlfriend? 1 year where, what if I had a better sleep schedule, better diet, better training regimen, all this stuff. I told myself, I'm like, all right, I'm going to do 1 year of not a single sacrifice and see what the results are. And in the grand scheme, like, a year flies by. Like, a year is such a tiny little sliver that I was like, okay, I'm going to do everything. So there were some moments of that year that were super disappointing, having to miss out on life events, like my buddy's getting married and I can't go to his bachelor party, or little things like that, or just not having a girlfriend, being alone. But I was like, all right, after this year, if I didn't like the results, if I don't get the results I want, if the whole process was just miserable, well, I'll go back. I'll go back to those other things. But I won, after a year of that dedication, I won the world championships. I won by the largest margin of victory ever in that competition. And I was like, oh, that was all worth it. It was great. And so then after that, it was finding more places that I can get a little bit better and getting more dedicated to it. And then, I just kept building off that. And then at some point it was like, oh, I'm never going to be an engineer. This is it. This is way better than sitting behind a desk. So, it just kind of built organically, it's just like the opportunities just got a little bit bigger each time. So it wasn't like an overnight change. It was just piece by piece. But I think one big factor in all of it, I've actually talked to a friend about this, it's the super sexy things of, burn all the ships and go all in, don't give yourself another option. I did the exact opposite. I set up my life so that there was as little risk as possible. I lived in my parents' basement for as long as possible so that I didn't have bills. I drove an old beat up car that I bought for $300 so that I didn't have a car payment, so that I was able to afford to live this lifestyle with this huge, huge risk. But then there's no pressure. It's like, if I go to this competition and I fail, I'm not letting down my family. I'm not losing my house. I'm not losing my car. So I literally try to live as close to zero expenses as possible so I could afford to take this risk. And then, it just kind of built up slowly from there. And I was like, oh, okay, now I can afford to get a house. Now I can afford to get a reliable car and all these different things. But yeah, I think it's just so common to hear this going all in, throwing risk to the wind and not caring. It's like, I didn't do that.
But then 2019 comes around, and this was an interesting year, right? I remember you faced a bit of adversity and a questionable situation, right? But at the same time, it wasn't this huge margin of victory. You were almost coming from behind their entire games. Yeah,
2019, there's a couple different factors that played into it. So that in 2019, they went with a format in the competition that it was just out of left field. Every year they're changing the rules, they're changing the qualifying procedures, they're changing the scoring. It really puts you in a test of like, okay, who can accept the things that they cannot change? It's all right, what is the scoring system? Cool. I'm trying not to argue it. I'm trying not to let it rent space in my head. I'm not listening to rumors. I wait until I hear the facts of what it is, and then I put my attack plan together. And so, they announced the scoring system, and they're doing cuts throughout the week of like, after event 4, we're cutting down to the top 20 athletes. After event 5, we're cutting down to the top 10. There's nothing I can do about it. It's not an ideal. I don't think it worked well. I think it looked terrible. And I think it negatively affected the scoring in terms of like, you could afford a bad finish early on, and then you hope that your strength showed up later in the week. But it was a great mental test of, okay, this isn't what you want. This isn't ideal. This doesn't work well for you, but you don't have a choice. Deal with it. So, there's a combination of the scoring system. I got hit with a pretty rough penalty early on that, it stripped, I think it was like 30 or 40 points. And, a winning event is 100 points. So it was a pretty big hit. But then once again, by the end of the weekend, I was thankful it all happened, because the 3 years prior to that, when I've won, it was by a large margin of victory. And so people started thinking that, oh, he only competes well when he doesn't have any pressure. He doesn't do well under pressure. And I remember hearing people say these things and telling them, just because you've never seen me compete under pressure doesn't mean I'm not good at it. Be better. Put me under pressure. And so then it happened. I remember the specific event. I remember where I was standing. I remember everything about that. And I was down by 50 points. And I had a great opportunity to gain a large chunk of those points back. And all I heard was the criticisms. All I was hearing was the commentators, the other competitors saying that I don't do well under pressure. And I remember telling myself, like, all right, good. They say you don't do well under pressure. Let's show them. Let's shut them up. This is an opportunity that you haven't been put in before. Let's rise to the occasion. And it's a very freeing feeling having your back against the wall, because you're already failing. You can't get worse. Just swing for the fences and try to connect and knock it over the fence. And a moment like that was great, because then it was an opportunity like this, the last weakness that people have seen in me. This is the one situation that I haven't been in. I get to prove it to everyone that, I'm good at this too. Yeah. So, that one worked out. In some ways it was stressful. In some ways it was very freeing of, there's no pressure on me. I'm in second place. All I can do is go up. So it was nice leaving that competition knowing that, like, okay, I don't have to be in the lead going into the final event. I don't have to be in the lead by 100 points to win or perform. I can do that too.
And what was the feeling like at that event, basically finishing in first place by the narrowest margin of victory? Probably it's like 2010.
It was a big relief, obviously, of like, okay, because, I've been training with this one goal of, breaking the record for the amount of consecutive wins. And that competition, I felt like things were literally going against me, like the penalty that I got, it was an equipment malfunction. There was like literally nothing I could have done. And I didn't find out until after the event was over that something went wrong. For the competition, I'm thinking like, man, if it's because of that error that it derails my entire career goal, like it doesn't feel good. It's not like I worked my ass off, and because a sandbag fell out of my backpack and I didn't realize it, well, now my career's over, or like not my career's over, but that's what it feels like. It was incredibly stressful with that. And it was super disappointing to think that that could be a reality. But then at the same time, going out for the last event, it was a very powerful feeling walking out on the floor. And so the final event was 30 clean and jerks, 30 ring muscle ups, 30 snatches. So it's a great workout for the guy that's like right on my heels. But going out there and like in my head, there was no option. It was like, no, I'm winning this event. It doesn't matter how much better you are than me at this. The amount of passion that I have behind this, there's no skill level that can trump it. I am willing to go to lengths and depths that I know that you are not willing to touch. So I went onto the floor for that last event, knowing that I was going to win. Like there was no doubt in my mind. It was like, you can be better than me at this, but I will hurt and suffer tenfold of what you will. And I know that for a fact. And sure enough, like he was much better composed through the workout. He attacked it much more appropriately, but I went into it knowing like, no, I'm going to hit this thing aggressively. And, it wasn't the best strategy by any means. It was a terrible strategy, but I wanted to rely on my heart rather than like my muscles, as corny as that sounds, because I knew I can put myself into this deficit and still pull through because it's what I want. It's what I've decided is already happening.
And looking back at all this, like, has there been, like, if you had to describe what's driving you throughout all this, like to be the best, to ultimately, you know, have such excellence, like what's the why behind it all?
There's a million different reasons. A couple of them are reoccurring, kind of dependent on the mood. You know, every day in the gym, I'd say like in the gym, there's probably dozens of different reasons why I train the way I did in the gym. But there was 2 or 3 that were like a reoccurring theme. I'd say the most common one was like, I want to have a cool fucking story when I'm old. Whether it's I'm talking to my kids about my career, I'm talking to my grandkids, whatever it is, I want to have a cool story. That was the biggest thing I admire from my dad when he would tell me stories about his figure skating career. They were just cool ass stories of him traveling the world, having these life experiences. You know, he and my mom met in figure skating. But just, I wanted to have a cool story. I didn't want to have a story of like, oh, I competed at the CrossFit game once or twice. I did all right, finished middle of the pack. No, like I won that. At the time, it was the most event wins ever. It was the biggest margin of victory. I wanted to have a cool fucking story to tell people. And then the other theme was like, I want to have a life that I want to live, not a life that I have to live. And by that, you know, I don't ever want to be constrained by like a financial situation of like, oh, I have to live in this part of town because that's what I can afford. I have to drive this car because that's what I can afford. I wanted the freedom to live the life that I wanted. And so I don't even like when it comes to earning money, I don't give a shit about the money. I care about the freedom that it provides. I don't have to work for a bad boss. I don't have to show up on Monday for hours. I don't have to show up on the weekend to work overtime. I wanted the freedom to do whatever I wanted. So, you know, if I don't have a passion for a year, yeah, I can sit at home. I don't have to go flip burgers to, you know, pay the rent or whatever it is. No, I wanted that freedom. For me, when I was competing, it was like, no, if I want that freedom later on in my life, I need to do these shitty rowing intervals. I need to make it really, really hurt. It's not enjoyable. I don't like doing rowing intervals. I don't like doing heavy sets of back squats. There's nothing enjoyable about that. But the sense of pride and the freedom is going to provide down the road, that's what I'm after. I remember someone asked me like, hey, do you have an addiction to suffering? And I was like, no. Like not even in the slightest. I don't enjoy it at all. I have an addiction to what the product of suffering is, of putting in those hours, doing the things that I have to do so that later on I can do the things that I want to do. It's just always working for that better tomorrow.
While Matt Fraser has become a dominant force in the CrossFit arena, our next guest has become a dominant force in the legal arena. John Morgan is the founder and CEO of America's largest injury law firm, Morgan & Morgan, and he believes that hunger, the insatiable desire to win, can't be taught. You're born with it. One of my favorite moments from our conversation, which was recorded live during the Evolve Virtual Summit, was when John described how he's able to gauge whether or not someone has that hunger.
I've always been fascinated with paper boys. And I'll tell you why I've been fascinated with paper boys. Paper boys are 10, 11, 12 years. They don't even have paper boys anymore. But you're 10 or 11 years old. And you're tied to this job every day. Rain, sleet, snow, grouchy customers, bad customers. But you do it every single day. Those paper boys, I believe, are lions. They have that internal it. Warren Buffett was a paper boy. Oprah Winfrey was a paper girl. When I meet people, especially my age, I'll say, can I ask you a question? I say, what? I say, were you a paper boy? Were you a paper girl? And when they tell me they were, it's like my own little Briggs-Meyer personality test. I know who I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a lion or not. And so that is the internal thing. And it's just as lucky as being Shaquille O'Neal and being 7'2" and run like a gazelle.
And I imagine it's probably going to lead to a very frustrating, difficult life if you're not that person, but you try to be. If the sloth tries to be the lion, right?
But here's the great thing. There's also another animal, and they're mules. There's the hard-working mule, and there's the lazy mule. The hard-working mule, you put that hat up on the ears, and the ears stick out, the daisies, and that mule can plow all day long. And then you got another mule who's built the same way but won't do anything. The one secret that I have found, it's not brains, it's the willingness to work. Nobody that I know that's very successful has not been a hard worker. And so if you think you're missing something, put the time in. When I look around my firm and around the offices in America, when I look at the most successful people, they're the people in the office. They're the people trying the cases. They're the people working on the weekends. The common denominator for the most successful people that I know in my life is not that they were the smartest, is they were the hardest working. So you can actually work yourself to where you want to be, even if you're a mule, because mules can work for 10 hours. And at the end of the day, there's this beautiful field that produces a whole bunch of vegetables.
I remember in that You Can't Teach Hunger, you talk about there's some that go, coming out of the weekend, they come back as satiable slugs. And then there's others that are just constantly insatiable. You ask them, when are you done? They're not done. When is it enough? It's never enough.
There's two types of people. And here's the problem inside of our firms. Inside of all of our firms, you have you, and then you have the people inside of your firm. You have one business objective. The people working with you or for you have another objective. Now, their objective may not be what your objective is. Their objective may be, I got to work this hard, get this much, and then I want quality of life. And almost everybody has a limit of satiability. They'll say, if I get that, I'm done. Most people, I'd say 95% or more, have a satiable appetite. But then there's that rare bird that has an insatiable appetite. And no matter what they have, they want more. And it's not about money, because you can only eat one cheeseburger and drink one Maker's Mark. Your pockets are bulging, but you can't eat more than one cheeseburger and one Maker's Mark. It's about winning. It's about succeeding. It's about being respected. And so what I'm always looking for inside of all of my organizations are those people who have that insatiable appetite, that they're never going to stop because they want to be successful, respected, and revered.
You had an early job, I think, as Pluto, right, at Disney World. Could you imagine that?
I did magic at Disney. I was Pluto at Disney. I love Disney. I love Walt Disney. I met Roy Disney one night when I was doing magic at Merlin's. He came in, and I said, where do you stay when you come here? And he points out, I was at Merlin's magic store, and he points out of the castle, and he says, I stay there. I go, where? He goes, Walt built us an apartment there. I said, Mr. Disney, I can't believe I'm meeting you. He said, John, don't call me Mr. Disney, call me Roy. I said, why? He goes, call me Roy. And I decided that night at Merlin's Magic Shop, if I ever had a business, nobody ever called me Mr. Morgan. Everybody called me John. So anytime anybody tries to call me John or Mr. Morgan, no go. It's if Walt Disney can be Walt, I can be John. And I loved working at Disney. The best thing about, like, when I was Pluto, and I'd be standing at Main Gate, tram, the monorail's coming at the beginning of the day, and you look up, and here comes grown men in sandals, running, full tilt, knocking kids down to come take a picture with Pluto and Mickey. In the first of the day, we had the VIP unit out there. All day long, you're working with people who are having the single best day of their entire life. They've come to Disney World. So I loved that. And so I was inspired by Walt Disney and my time at Disney World.
So you mentioned Roy Disney. So Walt, the visionary, he had Roy. Do you have a Roy?
I have a Roy. My wife is very smart. I kind of consider her my Roy. The only thing that she has not understood yet is she thinks she has an absolute veto on everything. And so our fights come from, I'm looking for advice. I'm not looking for a veto. So whenever we clash, but I rely on her. And yeah, look, if you read a book a long time ago called The Millionaire Next Door, it takes two guys that make the same amount of money, but at the end of their life, one has a lot of money and one doesn't have a lot of money. The one thing you find about the people who have a lot of money, rule number one, stay married. When you start cutting shit in half, you lose half. The Millionaire Next Door always relied on professionals, CPAs and lawyers. And even though we're lawyers, we're not that kind of lawyer. So I rely heavily. So I got a whole team of Roys around me.
In terms of other causes, I know now you've expanded in Florida, really pushing for raising the minimum wage and then the legalization of marijuana. So I know those are things you're very, very passionate about. If you kind of speak to those, and then I want to talk about the pot daddy stuff.
First of all, I think politics is broken. My wife's Republican. I was a Democrat. I look at the left. They're crazier than hell. I look at the right. I mean, listen, when people are wearing buffalo hats with horns, I'm out. What I believe is that most of us agree about most things. You know, I was polling real high. Everybody wanted me to run for governor. I was polling real high. But, you know, I don't want to get chewed up like that. Plus, you know, I live in Hawaii half the year. My brother was paralyzed, and marijuana has been a very important part of his life. Because if he didn't use it, Percocet, Xanax, I mean, he was a zombie. And so I decided to try to legalize medical marijuana. And I missed the first time by a fraction. And I came back and did it again and passed it with 71% of the vote. And then I believe the reason this country is so mad is that the have-nots are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I believe one day, we don't think it could happen. Marie Antoinette didn't think it could happen. Batista didn't think it could happen. The Tsar didn't think it. You push people so far, they'll just come take your shit because nothing from nothing equals nothing. If your kid's hungry, people are leaving islands in cardboard boats because nothing from nothing equals nothing. So I believe that the issue of our day is income inequality. So I said, you know what? I've already passed marijuana. I believe in the minimum wage. I passed the minimum wage, which is hard in a state like Florida, with 61% of the vote, a landslide. What that proved to me was that most of us agree on most things. But if you put an R or a D next to it, we don't agree except about 47% on one side and 47% on the other, and the 6% decide the best. So I did the marijuana for my brother. I did the minimum wage because I feel passionately. I pay all my people at least $15 an hour. And I think I wanted to prove to America and to other politicians, and I think you'll see now, people are always talking about Florida's minimum wage. I think in this deep South, for that to have happened was a seismic shift, and now you're seeing businesses are voluntarily raising their wage to 16, 17. And I believe it's good politics for self-preservation, because if you don't, there will be a day where you'll be living in Mad Max, where people will be coming into your house, taking your stuff because you get so desperate, you have no choice. So those have been the things I've done in Florida, very gratified, and it's worked out for me because I've been like on a crusade down in Florida for 10 years.
Now, there's going to be some people that are watching this or listening to this, and they'll say, well, that's easy for him to say, it's easy for him to do. And a lot of what we talked about yesterday is the fact that everything worthwhile is an uphill climb. And it seems like everything you try to do, there's always some resistance or pushback against it. Like I even saw recently, they're trying to cap the amount that you can actually donate to some of these causes and so on. If you could speak to just the friction that you've had to go up against to really get things done, and not just with the marijuana or the minimum wage, but just even in growing the law firm.
Well, look, there's always resistance. There's always vision blockers, I call them. There's always somebody trying to stop you from doing this. Anything that's worthwhile is not easy. But what I would say to that is this. Sam Walton had 10 rules. Number 10 was the most important. And what he said was swim upstream. When you see people coming downstream, they're on these big floats, sucking on Mai Tais, cocoa butter all over their fat asses, just rolling down the river. They don't know where they're going. They're just going somewhere fast. And maybe over. But Sam Walton said, swim upstream. So you're in there swimming upstream. You're passing the people in the floats and the inner tubes, sucking on the Mai Tais with the cocoa butter, who may be going to their death. But once you get to the top, there's a very furrowed, fallowed soil. And when Sam Walton left downtown Ben Franklin and went out to a field and built a box, kind of a box like this, everybody said, you're crazy. But guess what? He swam upstream. And what I will tell you, Mike, is when people tell you you can't, that just means they can't. That doesn't mean you can't. That just means they won't. It doesn't mean you won't. And so when people say no, I have a saying, no means yes. People tell me no means yes. And so you have to make sure that you understand that a lot of people are trying to stop you from being great because they know they can't be great. And misery loves company.
Love him or hate him, there's something we can all learn from John's approach to growth. Brian Panish, one of the nation's leading trial attorneys and founding partner of Panish, Shea, and Boyle, also shared what separates good lawyers from the great ones.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things, but it's about winning. It's about competition, never giving up. But really, the most important thing, I think, is the passion for what you do. For me, it's about the clients. And I just love hearing the stories of all these different people. Look, I grew up in this city, in the inner city. I knew all kinds of people from every race, religion, color, hang out with them. When I was at college, there's different races on the football team. A college I went to was a redneck kind of area, big agriculture area. So I just love all the different people and the jurors and the clients and the competition I really love. And I took something from Edward Bennett Williams, which one of my mentors, Brown Green, told me, that Edward Bennett Williams, he lived contest living. And in life, there's really three areas where there's always a winner and loser. In today's society, everybody gets a trophy, everybody gets recognition. But in three areas of life, number one, politics. Number two, athletics. And number three, courtroom law. Those things all kind of work for me. I've been very involved in politics, but athletics and the courtroom, it's a little tougher because you don't get to do as many trials as you do play games. And, we play a game, you have a bad loss, you can't sit around and think about it. You got to go back to the next day to practice and move on. So we have a 24-hour rule here where you can celebrate or commiserate for one day, and then you got to move on to the next case.
Yeah, it's interesting when you mentioned that, in life, especially as you talk about participation trophies and winners and losers, what do you think is really the difference between the two? I imagine it's a function of discipline and accountability. Those are probably big components, but what are the biggest separators?
Well, I just read a book called Winning by Tim Grover. I don't know if I would recommend that to everyone. He lists factors for winning, but he lists everyone with a number one. And his philosophy is, well, if you have a number 5, you're not going to pay attention to that as much as number 1. And a lot of what he talks about is, his first book was called Relentless, but he talks about somebody else has winning. You need to take it from them. Winning, you hear a lot of people say, oh, it's a marathon. It's not a marathon. It's a sprint that never ends. And this mindset, I think, can drive a lot of people to be successful, but dedication, hard work, all that is a given. We don't even look into that. That's given. The knowledge of the subject matter, all of that. It's more the mindset of how you go about it, what you do to perfect it, and how you carry it out every day.
I've heard you say this so many times, that doing more trials, getting in the courtroom, so much of it seems like just being in the arena, but a large majority of even trial lawyers, it's almost like, I don't know if there's like this apprehension to trying cases, or they want to be perfect, or they're trying to watch webinars or whatever it is, but it seems like you were just like, just get on the field.
You do, but you want to be prepared for it. That's why the training is so critical, and to try out new things, to try, not be afraid to experiment and try the thing. Look, a lot of the things that I have been successful with other lawyers invented it. And I've, as we all have, taken from others and learned from so many others, from Mo Levine, all these great lawyers, and reading the books and going to the seminars. I did all that too. I still read the books about the lawyers and the techniques, but I think it's working on it. And that's what I get from the sports, whether it be golf, tennis. You have to keep working on that skill to get better. And I see these kids, like my kids, they have personal coaches. Why aren't lawyers being trained by coaches and trainers like professional athletes and others? And that's what I've tried to incorporate into our firm, is that level of training to get better, to excel.
And I've heard you encourage other law firm owners to pay attention to the business of law and to not lose sight of the business side when they're really trying to grow their firms. If you could elaborate on that.
Well, a lot of lawyers, they just say, "Oh, just give me the file. I want to go to trial." But, if you're running a big firm, it's a business. You have to have the right people in place. You have to monitor your spending, your marketing. I mean, there's a whole bunch to running a law firm, and many great trial lawyers aren't always the greatest businessmen. So you want to get with other people that may be good at that. Some lawyers, you don't want them to do anything on the business side. You just want them to be in trial every day. That's where they excel. But if you really want to have a firm, you want to grow it, and you want to be successful, you have to pay attention to all those details. They don't really talk about them that much at these seminars. It's more sexy to hear the lawyer talk about how you get the $100 million verdict versus how you get the right malpractice insurance and how you keep your overhead down in running a firm. They're very important. And as a plaintiff lawyer growing up, seeing my dad, who eventually was a plaintiff lawyer, there can be some lean times. And that's just part of the business that we're in.
And just like in professional sports, the importance of building strong teams and having, just great teamwork. I know you mentioned this in building a great team at your practice. Like, what were some of the lessons that you learned over time in building the organization, particularly with the team?
The number one thing that is important in a law firm is culture, just like a team, just like a locker room. If you have people that are committed to the goals of the firm and create that culture, you're going to do fine. But if you have people, we used to call it in football, the coach say, guys that have shit in their nose and they got a runny nose and they're in the locker room and they're changing, and the next guy next to him, they're not playing, or in a law firm, they're not getting the good cases. Then they start complaining and he starts giving it to him. And it's going around the locker room. Unless you have leadership and leaders and a culture that's defined, that's going to permeate in your law firm. So I think number one is the culture and defining who you are and what you want to be. And for us, our culture is we're going to get the best results for the clients. We're going to do the best work. We're going to try the case if they're not going to pay what's fair and reasonable for the client. And we're going to continue to do a great job and build our brand and our reputation and continue to get better. And if you do that, you're going to be successful. But if people don't want to work here, then I'm the first one to tell them, hey, if this ain't working out for you, go ahead. The coach, you go complain to the coach and say, I'm not playing. They're like, well, maybe you should do something about it or go to another team. And you see that in college football with this portal now. You get these 19-year-old kids, they go to school, all of a sudden the other guy beats them out. Tomorrow they leave. That's not the culture you want to establish. And you see that in college athletics now, big time.
And speaking of culture, as you've described yours, I imagine there's a lot of people who are going to listen to this podcast and say, I want that same culture at my law firm. But what are some of the decisions that you're making, whether it's, certain non-negotiables, certain things that you do not tolerate, whether it's certain types of people that you hire, or certain people that you have to exit from the firm, that ensure that culture stays what it is?
Well, I think number one, they have to be dedicated to the practice and the clients, and they got to know about the cases. They got to work hard, but they got to know that it's not about them. It's always about the client, and it's the client comes first. It's not about them getting a big verdict or getting the headlines. It's about doing the right thing for the client. And if you keep that in mind, you're always right. It's when you stray from that and you want to get a bigger verdict and you don't want to settle or do whatever it takes to get out there in the media. Sometimes it's not advisable to go out of the media. It's not always a good thing. But people are more into themselves. Tim, you can ask Tim Grover about this lying to oneself is another one of his factors or themes where people are so busy out there in the social media or puffing up what they've done versus spending the time to go out and do it and accomplish it themselves. And that lying to oneself, that's one of his big things that he talks about.
So, Brian, as you grew the practice just over the years, what were some of the biggest mistakes you made? Because I'd love to hear about some of those and then some of the things that you learned in the process.
Well, obviously, the biggest mistakes plaintiff lawyers make is case selection. If you have that down, you're going to be way better off. And at times, we've got involved in cases that we shouldn't have. And we've learned from that. So I would say that would be a big mistake. I think maybe for me, not having been more global. And it's what I mean by that is, I mean, I was involved in MDL type litigations around the country, but now I'm much more involved in other states in the West. And I think what I've encouraging all the lawyers of my firm now to do as soon as they take the bar is to get admitted in another state and to expand your practice that way. I've done that at the end of I say I'm in the third quarter. I'm like a redshirt junior, but up front. So now I give a special bonus for every lawyer after they take the bar if they go take another bar, and to help them expand their practice globally, whether it be in California, Nevada, I'm in Texas or Washington. I like to do cases in other places too, and to learn more. So I think not thinking as globally, I was more initially California. It was a big place, California. And there's different parts of the state, and I've done all over the state, but now I'll be involved in Nevada and Arizona, Washington, and Texas. Just finished a case in Texas. It's expanding the horizon, so I like it. So I think globally earlier.
And what about other law firms? I know some firms, they look at every other firm around them in their market as a competitor. How do you view that? You view that as competition, or you view something else?
One time I was fishing with my dad in a lake, and these guys across from us were catching all kinds of fish. And of course, they were illegally chumming and stuff. But I'm like, come on, man, those guys are beating us. He says, what you need to know in life is you need to compete with yourself, not others. Now, we know what everyone's doing. We see what other law firms are doing. Some are doing good things. Some do things I wouldn't do. I have respect for them. And I guess you could say some are competitors, but I don't really see that as much today. In the way the practice is, it used to be we would go around and there'd be 5 law firms interviewing for a case. That doesn't happen as much today. With the internet, with TV marketing, that has changed. The practice, particularly here in Los Angeles, since when I became a lawyer in 1984 to today, is dramatically changed. And you have to be able to change with the times.
When you get to the level that Brian's gotten to, your only competition is yourself. Tim Grover knows this all too well. He's served as the performance coach to the most elite athletes on the planet, including Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. He's also the best-selling author of Relentless and Winning. To set the tone for our conversation, I asked Tim about his decision to write his most recent New York Times bestseller, Winning.
Well, you know what? I didn't want to do a workout book. So everybody was telling me, obviously that's what I'm most famous for, is the individuals that I've worked with. But workouts change so often, and everybody wanted to know how these individuals, they got to be at the top and stay at the top, and even when they fell, how they got back to the top. And I was like, and mindset was too of a general topic. Everyone loves to talk about mindset. Well, what the hell is mindset? Well, I needed a better definition. So instead of mindset, it's the winning mind. There's a huge difference between just a general mindset and having a mindset of actually winning. So what my individuals did, they just constantly won over and over and over again, not just in their sports, but in business and whatever they did. So being around those individuals, being able to study, ask them questions, see things that nobody else was able to see, having conversations that nobody else was privy to. I mean, literally to be able to sit down with Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, Derek Jeter, and just listening to them talk. No cameras around, no nothing. And how competitive they were, the things that were coming up. And I was like, you know what? There is a really big misconception of what it takes to be successful and what it takes to really be classified as a winner. And I'm known as that individual that I say what others won't say, and I see what others aren't willing to see. So when I wrote this book with my co-author, Sherry Wank, I wanted to put the real language of winning, what it really, really takes. It's not about the parade. It's not about the streamers. It's not about the confetti. It's about the road that you take, the amount of time you spend to capture that win, and how quickly that win can be taken away from you. Because everybody thinks once you become a winner, you're always a winner. But no one understands most people are actually afraid to win. And I give the reasons of why they're afraid to win.
When you wrote this book, who was this book for? Because were you trying to convert anybody, or were you just trying to reinforce people? Because as I was reading this, I mean, I probably was nodding along the whole time. And then I spoke to a few colleagues of mine that read it, and they didn't like it. They didn't like the tone of it. I found that either there's some people that just, the true competitors, they love it. Like, it almost tells their life story in a way. And then there's other people who read it and say, I don't agree with that. That seems a little harsh.
Well, you know what? This is where I said, when you read this book, when you read my posts on Instagram, when you listen to me talk, take your emotions out of it. Just take your emotions out of it. Because most decisions are made because you get emotional about something, or something strikes you in a certain way, or brings up a bad memory. This book is for everyone. I always say, listen, I'm not for everyone. I should be, but I'm not. Not everybody has this intensity. Not everybody has this desire to be the best. Not everybody has this desire to compete, not just to compete, but to compete to win. You know, we're in a place now where people are so worried about stepping on people's toes, and winning requires you to step on their throats by your results. And for a lot of people, it is harsh. It is harsh, because if you have the mentality of a winner and you can actually execute at it, you separate yourself from the pack. So you get to see, you get exposed. You get exposed to not being in the middle. You get exposed to the decisions you make, the things that you say. You're putting yourself away from the pack. And once people start to pull themselves away from the pack and realize how much little protection or support they actually have, and how much it's really on them, they're like, yeah, this might be a little bit too much. So it's easy for them to kind of go back into the middle of the pack. When the first book, Relentless, it was like everybody's dirty little secret. People would hand it to, hey, I need you to read this book underneath the table. And it's just like, people don't want to admit that's who they really are. Because in society, if you're built that way, or you think that way, you're not a nice person, or people have perceptions of you. And this has got nothing to do with being nice, being hated, being good, being bad. No matter what decision you make, no matter who you're with, some people are always going to be with you. Some people are not going to be with you. Some people are going to agree with your decisions. Others aren't going to agree with your decisions. This is about you standing up for what you believe in and going after what's important to you. What do your wins mean for you? For a lot of people, it's financial. For other people, it could be raising their kids. For others, it could be the charitable things that they have, being the best school teacher, being the best, whatever it is. You have to define what winning means to you. And if you take that mentality, you'll see that if it's that important to you, this book is you.
I want to touch on the process of winning. So Matt Fraser was on the podcast, 5-time CrossFit Games champion. And I was asking him, I'm like, Matt, you have this, this immense drive to compete. What about the training? He's like, I hated the training. He's like, every minute of every day had to be managed, from when I went to sleep, from when I ate, from when I trained. He's like, it's miserable. But so I asked him, I was like, so why did you do it? He's like, well, because I crave that result.
That's it. I mean, what else is there? What else is there left to say? Training is hard. All right. It is hard. It's supposed to be hard. Winning is hard. All right. Eating properly is hard. Saving money is investing. All these things it is supposed to be hard. Everybody's looking for that easy path. Everybody's looking for those steps. That's why when I was writing the book, one of the big things that Sherry and I we were discussing with a publisher and other individuals, everybody was saying, you got to put steps in there because steps sell books. 5 easy steps, 10 steps to greatness, 5 steps to success. You're talking about the most fittest human being in the world, all right? Have him run up a flight of steps, all right? I don't care what kind of shape you're in. That shit is hard. And everyone's looking for those easy steps. There are no easy steps. No, we're trying to make everything easy. When I go to work out, I used to see advertisements all the time about, work out in the comfort and ease of your own home. If a workout is comfortable and easy, it's not a workout. It's not a workout, but that's what sells. And motivation sells too. That's why there's so many individuals out there that sell motivation, because when they're selling motivation, that means you're going to keep buying. I don't sell motivation. I sell elevation. All right? And the big difference between the two is, exactly what Matt said. All right. Motivated individual, you have to constantly keep selling motivation is, man, you got to convince every single day that, yes, the workouts are hard. It is nasty. It is going to be unpolished. I have to manage all those individuals. When you sell elevation is internal. It's not external. Motivation is external. All right. Elevation is internal. They know when they get to the gym, when they get up, yes, this is going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. It's going to be nasty. It's going to be tough. I know it's going to be painstaking, but they take that accountability on themselves. And there's a huge difference between motivation and elevation. Motivation is that sugar high. It's that initial sugar high. You get really spiked up. I see people that go to these events all the time and they come in and they're all pumped up and they're like, yes, I'm ready to go. But they have no direction of where they're going in. I tell you, the most popular, when I give my presentations, I don't want a standing ovation. When I get done, I want complete silence in the room. Because then I know those individuals, they truly, when they say they're ready to run through a wall, they're going to run through that wall. They are going to run through that wall because that's something that's going to last, that's going to stay with them. And winning stays with you. Your wins stay with you. No one can ever take those wins away from you. Nobody can ever take your elevated mindset away from you. They can take your motivation away from you, because motivation, you got it through somebody else. But what you earned on your own, no one can take that away from you.
There's a chapter when you talk about, the price of winning and in this idea of balance. It's interesting. I know you give a lot of examples and a lot of the athletes and the entrepreneurs you work with, but you were right there with them also making a lot of these sacrifices. And in particular, one of the stories you tell was the one with your daughter. And if you're open to sharing it, me reading it, I have 2 young girls, so I'm reading this stuff and I imagine it's not an easy story to tell.
It's not. It's still difficult now. Everybody's had to make this decision. I'm sitting there. For my work, I travel constantly because my clients require me to be in certain places. I got to go. It's a commitment I made for myself. It's a commitment I made to them. It's a commitment I made to winning. So, I was packing. I packed my own stuff. My daughter walks in and she goes, "Daddy, why do you travel so much?" And I said, "Honey, this is how, I take care of you. This is how I take care of Mom. This is how I put food on the table." And she goes, "Dad, if I eat less, will you stay home more?" In the Hollywood ending, I would unpack my bag. I would have stayed. We'd have gone out for ice cream. I kept packing. Those are the decisions that winning requires you to make. Not the easy ones. Anybody can make the easy ones. That's why everybody doesn't win. Because those are the decisions winning is going to test you with. And later on, I had that conversation with her. And I thought I had done things wrong. In her eyes, found out that before I could even finish a conversation, she goes, Dad, I understand. You set an example for me to go after what's important to you. And she goes, if you didn't, she goes, I would have felt bad. And because of those decisions you made, I've benefited so much more now. So that's why I said, if you're going to make those hard decisions, you're going to do those things, you have to go get those wins. There's so many individuals that go out there, they don't get those wins because it takes a different mindset. It requires you to be different. I said, winning requires you to be different, and different scares people. Like, a lot of people are scared to make that decision. After all these years, it still affects me now. Well, it still affects me now. But you're never going to have what that win means to you if you don't have the ability to make the unpopular decisions.
There's going to be people who hear stories like this, they'll read the book, and they'll hear about these sacrifices and say, well, why would I ever want to win then? Why, I'm not willing to do things like this. I would never do that. What do you think they're missing out on?
The way Kobe Bryant described winning, he said, winning is everything. There's a win. Listen, we have a chance to win every single day. Every single day there are wins around us. A lot of us can't even see them. They can't even see them. You miss out on opportunities when you don't talk to individuals, when you don't look at individuals in the eye, when you don't acknowledge an individual, when you don't simply speak. There's wins around us every single day, but you have to go get them. Yeah, you have to go get them. First, you have to be able to see them. First, you have to be able to acknowledge them. Winning gives you a feeling that you just can't describe. You really can't. I mean, you watch your favorite sports team, or you watch your favorite performer, or we watch all these awards for actors, actresses, business people, sports people, and if your sports team wins, you're up there. Why not have that feeling for yourself? Yeah, it may not be in the sports industry. How about being your own cheerleader and putting that same effort into something that's that important to you, and see how that feels. Everyone talks about the athlete, how much sacrifice they made, how talented they are, what they go through. Well, you can do the same thing. It may not be in that endeavor. I get this people all the time when I work with, especially with the quarterbacks I work with, people, you get these, I could do that. No, you can't. No, you can't. It's just like there's certain things, but find what you can do and go do it to the best of your ability. Don't try, because try gives you an out. Go do it. I got no problem with an individual who did everything they possibly could and failed. I have a problem with an individual who didn't.
We can all take away something from Tim's story, especially his understanding of the sacrifices and struggles required to win. But how can we know what is worth suffering for? And who better to ask than our next guest, New York Times bestselling author of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, Mark Manson.
So the title is a bit of a Trojan horse. It's like everybody's always stressed out these days. And so I think by putting not giving a fuck on the cover, it kind of tricks people into reading this book that they think is going to make them chill out. But I mean, essentially, like what not giving a fuck is, or essentially the question of what do you give a fuck about? It's a question of values and priorities. And I strongly believe that the core question of our day and age is what is worth caring about, or what is worth focusing on. We live in an age where we are constantly overwhelmed with information and opportunity. And so the biggest struggle for most of us is to figure out where to delegate our attention, our limited time and attention, like what is worth focusing on, what is worth caring about. And it's a really, really hard thing to figure out. And I think 5 years ago when the book came out, I think people were very unaware that struggle was going on within themselves. I think today people are generally aware that is a struggle, but we, as a culture, we still haven't really figured out how to tackle it.
Yeah, and it's I think there's a point in the book, I saw you post this recently on social media, where you say that you can't be an important and life-changing presence for some people without also being a joke and an embarrassment to others.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, it's anything that is I think kind of exceptional. Any action or behavior that is exceptional is going to be polarizing in its responses. So if you're acting and behaving in a way to minimize conflict or confrontation, you're basically optimizing for doing nothing important because anything important is going to have some sort of disagreement, or like people are going to see it differently. And so the more you're optimizing for something that's important, the more you're going to polarize people's responses. And I think the reason that feels profound, to me at least, is like, it's kind of an expectation. Like there's a little bit of a narrative bias in that, like, we look back in history, right? Like we look at somebody like Winston Churchill or like Theodore Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln. And today, with the benefit of 50 or 100 years of history, it's like, it is uncontroversial that what Churchill or Lincoln did is a positive thing. Like it is not really debatable by like 99% of people that what they did were positive things. But that's with the benefit of history. Like if you look at the decisions they made in their own time, they were highly controversial. People were extremely upset. There was lots of debate. Everybody was angry. And so I think we forget that. We forget that like there's pretty much never going to be that decision in your life that you are doing something both extremely important and extremely undivisive. The simple, like the really watered down version of it is just like, haters gonna hate.
Yeah, well, look, and it's true, and coming back this idea of happiness. I mean, because you confront it very early on. I mean, you say like this happiness stuff, it's a problem, and a lot of people believe like if I could just eliminate my problems, then I'll be happy. Like it's just this idea that let's say, whatever set of problems that somebody has, they resolve those things. And then in the absence of those problems, there's just joy and happiness. And I think there's a story that you share, and I love reading this, especially for the plot twist, right? Of the Himalayan prince. Which is a great way of depicting this. If you're open to sharing that, but I think that helps to give an idea of like really kind of the root of happiness and perhaps the importance of suffering.
Sure. I mean, it's this calls again right back to Eastern philosophy. I mean, it's essentially it's the mythological story of the Buddha, which is, and I think it's very profound the way that the Buddha's story is laid out traditionally, which is he's born a prince. All of his needs are fulfilled. His father's the king or the Raja or the Sultan or whatever they were called back then, gives him everything. Anything he wants, all the food, drink, party, music, whatever he wants, it's always provided for him. And he becomes a very deeply sad and unsatisfied person. And so he decides to go to the other extreme, which is he wants to limit or abstain from everything. So he decides to go be a beggar on the street because he identifies that his having everything he wants is what's causing him to be unhappy. So if he figures like, well, if I just have nothing that I want, then I'll achieve enlightenment and feel happy or whatever. So he goes and lives in the street as a beggar. And he realizes that sucks too. Like there's the same way you're, having everything you want just causes angst and stress in wanting more. Having nothing that you want causes angst and stress and wanting more. And so I think kind of the profound insight from his story is essentially that it's whether you are abundant in something or lacking in something, it's that attachment to that thing that is causing you to suffer, not the thing itself. I kind of modernize that in the book by talking, framing it in terms of happiness, which is like, if you think that you're going to get rid of all your problems and that's going to make you happy, well, trying to get rid of all your problems is itself a problem. Getting rid of your problems and keeping your life so that it has no problems is itself a problem. It's any solution to a problem merely presents a new problem. And so there's kind of this endless stream of problems in life. And our problem is not that we have problems. It's that we think that we shouldn't have them, or that our expectation is that, it's possible to live without problems. The chapter is very much just a call to find problems you enjoy having. Like that's essentially what happiness is finding the struggle that enlivens you, makes you excited to get up in the morning, feels meaningful, essentially. Because you're never going to get away from struggle, you're never going to get away from attachment, and you're never going to get away from problems. So you might as well find the ones that feel as though they are worth suffering for.
Yeah. And I know that you mentioned before that, like, when most people are asking, what do you want out of life? The probably a better question is, what pain do you want in your life, or what are you willing to struggle for? And because I think it can yield a very different answer. You ask somebody what do they want in life, they say I want to be happy, or there's this material thing, or whatever it is. But that's very nondescript. It's very ambiguous.
Yeah, well, and it's like not interesting, right? Like we all want the same stuff. Like we all want a nice house and a cool car and a great relationship and like tons of sex and money and fun and like a great family. Like we all want the same shit. Like there's nothing particularly interesting or unique about that. The thing that makes us who we are is like what we're actually willing to sacrifice, and what we enjoy sacrificing. Right. So like it's the reason I'm a writer is not because I like sold a bunch of books. The reason I'm a writer is because I enjoy sitting by myself for weeks and weeks and weeks and like rewriting the same page over and over and over again. It's the reason somebody's a lawyer is not necessarily because they went to law school. It's because they thrive among the challenges that are required to do the legal profession well. So it's not the thing that actually makes you a unique individual is what you're able to give up, or what you enjoy essentially giving up. Because we all want the same good stuff. It's like, that's a given.
And this kind of lends us to the fact that, to achieve any of this, and that going through the suffering, it's not always a great feeling. I mean, it's going to be difficult. You're going to experience adversity. It's going to be painful. It won't feel good. And I think unless you've gone through this journey and you've kind of, I guess through that action, you've achieved happiness or fulfillment or whatever it is in just that process itself, I think many people can associate what doesn't feel good as being the thing that they should not be doing.
Yeah. Well, and it's the fact that it doesn't feel good that makes it meaningful, right? Like, and I think this is an argument I make in my second book, which is that by making modern life so comfortable, so safe and comfortable, and kind of like emotionally insulated, we actually remove our ability to find meaning. Like if you think about like what are the most meaningful moments in your life, or like what are the things that you're most proud of in your life, there's not a single thing that you're proud of that didn't require some degree of struggle or sacrifice. Like it's a one-to-one relationship. Like there's, it's like nobody was like given a Ferrari for their birthday and they're like, man, I'm really proud of that Ferrari. It's like, you didn't do shit. It's like humans, it's just human nature. Like when things are given to you without any sort of sacrifice, you take it for granted. You don't appreciate it. And then it's the things that you struggle incredibly for that end up being the most meaningful things in your life. And so by like trying to insulate ourselves from any sort of struggle or hardship, the psychological side effect of that is that we tend to have more struggles with finding meaning or finding things that seem purposeful. Now, this isn't to say that we should all go back to like living in poverty and like killing each other. It's just to say that this is a side effect of the comforts of modern life, is that like, the same way a side effect of having the freedom to live wherever you want or work in any career you want is the stress and anxiety that comes with making the right choice. The side effect of being safe and comfortable is that you don't have as many opportunities to feel that sense of meaning that comes with sacrifice.
And it almost an idea that to truly be happy, one must also be in a state of constant struggle. I mean, I saw something you posted the other day where it said that the meaning your goals provide when you're working towards them is the meaning that is taken away once you achieve them. If you could elaborate on that.
Totally. And I experienced this hard, when my book took off and became a bestseller and everything, like it actually, like I was probably the most depressed I had been since I was a teenager, simply because I didn't know what the hell to do. Like, I'm like, okay, what now? You know, like I had this goal, kind of this dream of like becoming a best-selling author. And in my head, I thought, I was like, all right, I'm going to be writing books into my 40s and 50s, and I'm going to like build up a reputation and a core group of readers. And, maybe in like 10, 15 years, I'll get there. And it happened in like 3 months. And I spent like the next 6, like sitting around wondering what the hell to do with myself. Like my whole vision of my future and my identity was like kind of wrapped up in this long-term goal. And as soon as I got it, which was great, don't get me wrong, like I just felt very lost. So what you said is totally true, in that a prerequisite for happiness is a constant source of struggle. And like, it's funny because, again, if you look outside the realm of emotions, like this is just like an obvious thing in other aspects of life, right? So it's like like to have a healthy body, you have to constantly put it through stress and strain. To have a healthy career, you have to consistently surmount and overcome challenges. Like if you're working in a firm and like you're literally not accomplishing anything, like obviously you're not going to be promoted, or you're not going to be given more responsibilities. So it's like in every other aspect of life, like we just understand it as obvious that you need struggle to progress. You need struggle to remain healthy and happy. But for some reason, when it comes to kind of our emotional life, we have this weird expectation that we should just be able to be happy. Like we shouldn't have to deal with anything.
Anybody who's ever accomplished anything of significance knows that it often takes struggle to achieve success. But this often requires a great deal of mental toughness. James Lawrence is an expert in this field. He's an extreme endurance athlete, renowned speaker, and world record holder who's completed 101 consecutive Ironman-length triathlons in 101 days. I asked James what motivates him to set and achieve such ambitious goals.
Yeah, I joke all the time, and I'm saying, man, that escalated quickly. But it was over the course of a decade, and we broke the world record for the most half Ironmans. Then we broke the record for the most full Ironmans, which was 30 through 11 countries, all official events. Ended up winning 2 of those, placed second 5 times, and just had an unbelievable experience for myself. I learned a lot. It was a really great stepping stone. And, I talk about this a lot, about how when you're in the middle of something, it's like the hardest thing you can ever imagine and conceptualize, because that's the limit of your current experience and knowledge. But then once you overcome, you stick with it and you achieve that goal, then you look back and go, okay, I learned X, Y, Z, and I can now conceptualize and apply that to something even bigger. And so the 50 Ironmans in 50 days through 50 states came about, and we started to put that together. That was a 2.5-year planning process. Went and executed that amongst chaos, confusion, and disaster. And then again, that leads you to the belief that you can do more. And over the pandemic, because I'm in the world of speaking, coaching, racing, mentoring, and because of the pandemic, those are all group-related activities. And the world shut down. My world got shut down. And it was an opportunity for me to kind of give it a last go to see what I'm truly capable of. If we remove kind of that chaos, the logistics, the distractions, what is possible just mentally and physically. And so we settled on the number 100 consecutive full distance triathlons, all to be done here in Utah, just to find out, okay, is the mind and body capable of that type of stress for an entire quarter of a year?
So James, I'm curious, David Goggins, I think, once said something along the lines of like, when you're setting these like ultra ambitious goals, you're usually doing so from like the comfort of your home or the comfort of your couch. It's rare that you're doing it in the middle of it, right? In the middle of that struggle, you're probably thinking this is awful. So when you set out to do these things, what's that process like? And when are you usually setting those goals?
Yeah, definitely not during. I retire every race, especially in the middle of it when it's getting hard. You swear to yourself and commit to yourself that this is the very last one. And so I think we're blessed with short-term memory, and we tend to forget how bad the bad was, and we remember the good moments, the successes, and the victories. And I think that's a great way to be wired, because eventually we do something bigger and harder. And if we knew how difficult a challenge was always going to be, and we only remembered the hard times, we would never go and push our limits. And really, again, the concept of going from 0 to 100, I think, is flawed. And yes, I want people to set giant goals, but I don't want you to come up off the couch and set an impossible goal for yourself, because you're going to set yourself up for failure. These guys that are successful that you see in the limelight, that are at the top of their game, they went through insane struggles, adversity, and stepping stones along the way to get there. You don't just wake up and go, you know what, 100 Ironmans, 100 days, let's go. Because you will fail, I promise you that. You have to methodically attack it with intent to achieve the goal, and you need to gain momentum. You got to start chalking up little tiny wins along the way. If not, you're going to fail, and then now you're going to associate failure with you, which isn't who you are, right? We're all winners at our core. But if you go too big too quick, I promise you, you will fail, and then you're going to be labeled that, and it's going to be harder and harder to get off the ground doing successful things.
And you know, there's James Lawrence, and then there's Iron Cowboy. If you could speak to, how was this alter ego born? Like, at what moment?
So the name came in 2012 when we were breaking the world record for official events around the world. And my kids were really young, 10 and under. And it's the worst spectator sport on the planet. Like, it sucks. Like, you see me off, and then I'm gone for 7 hours, and then you come back. Well, that energy exchange is super important. I want it. The kids want it. And we all blend in as athletes, right? We're all wearing similar clothing. We're all, you know, this, that, and the other. And so I would wear a cowboy hat during the marathon portion of those runs. And my kids would see me, they get super excited. Hey, Dad's coming. Here comes the cowboy hat. And the public just started to call me the Iron Cowboy. And so that's where the name started. And then really during the 50 is when kind of that alter ego came, because I had to dig to a depth that I'd never been before. And to go into that extreme flow state, that requires you to put on your uniform, to be something different, to have that alter ego. And it's not a bad thing. People associate ego with a bad thing. It's not. It's getting your mind into a state where you can accomplish something that nobody else thought was possible. And so I've learned how to channel this individual when needed to be, or when I'm backed into a corner, when things get ugly. And that's in athletics, it's in parenting, it's in marriage, it's in friendships, it's in business. You have to figure out when it gets tough, and when things aren't going as well, and there's adversity and hardship right in front of you, you've got to be able to put on your tough boy uniform and power through it. And sometimes it takes that mental shift, and an alter ego is just a good cue, or a way to do it, to trick your mind to, like, okay, it's game time, is what we're doing right now. And when game time's on, there's no excuses, and it's easier to execute.
So, but I have to say, like, James, like, you are probably literally the only human being on this earth who has done the things that you've done. And yet I know, like, when you speak and when you inspire others, you're showing that it is possible. Yet I'm still curious, like, what do you do, or what do you believe you do that's different? Because, I mean, your results are clearly very different from the majority of other human beings on this planet. It's so easy and quantifiable. You eliminate any type of excuse or entitlement, and you show up and do the work. Like, that's seriously as simple as it can get. Look, everybody needs to stand up, look at themselves in the mirror, and go, okay, I'm in this position in my life because of me. I need to take full accountability for where I am. I'm broke, it's my fault. I'm rich, it's my fault. I'm fat, it's my fault. I'm fit, it's my fault. And once you can get to the realization that you're taking accountability for where you are in your life, only then can you start to make the changes that you need to. And so I don't think I'm any different than anybody else. I just make a conscious decision to take accountability for who I am, where I am. And if I want to see a change or don't like what I see, I just take the simple actions to make those changes. Nobody's going to change overnight, right? You can start to change your habits so that you can eventually change the pieces of yourself that you don't like, or the circumstances that you're in, but it takes time. And everybody gets so discouraged. And the easiest example is an overweight person that's 300 pounds and doesn't like the way they live. They go on a lifestyle change for 30 days. They didn't see the changes they want, and they abandon it. Well, newsflash, you didn't take 30 days to get to 300 pounds. That took a lifetime to do that. And so let's make some real change and look at what's causing the problem and actually make a change, and then take the time necessary. The biggest reason people fail, especially with big goals, is because they don't respect the time frame involved in order to have that change or that impact be in what they're doing. And so really,
on its surface, and obviously words are easier than actions, but on the surface, it's literally like make a commitment, take accountability, and then show up and do the work. And I love that my title sponsor, who I've been with a long time, First Form, their slogan is "We do the work." And they have an unbelievable culture there. They work hard. They're super successful. You want to talk about a successful company working out of the back of your car to over $400 million. Are you kidding me? In supplements? Like, that's a phenomenal story. And their tagline is like, look, I lead with integrity. I do things at a high level. I show up consistently, and we do the work. They're accountable for the results that they get. And I think as humans, we all need to take accountability for the results in our current lives. If you don't like it, make a change. And I'm speaking specifically to the individuals that live in the United States, because that's the landscape that I know. Trust me, I came to this country with no money in my pocket. I knew one person. And I said, I'm going to give myself a future. I found a beautiful woman. We have kids together. We are living the American dream, and I'm an entrepreneur, and I have complete freedom.
And James, as you look back, just even across your journey, are you proud of yourself?
Absolutely. We're not perfect. We've never claimed to be perfect. We make mistakes. We're human like everybody else. Anybody that says they're perfect is a complete liar and full of themselves, and they're just having an ego party with themselves. But yeah, absolutely proud of what we did. This last campaign was executed exactly how we wanted to. I didn't want to have those injuries that I did. I didn't want to have to battle in the way that I did. But I think it brought value to a lot of people that wouldn't have been able to join us had I been at 100% the whole time. It allowed people to participate with us that wouldn't have been able to. I think it had a lot of meaning to it. But absolutely, without a doubt, I couldn't be more proud of myself and the team, the way that we executed. We try to do everything with integrity and openness, and welcome all people to join with us.
Regardless of the goals that you set out to achieve, James reminds us that we have absolutely no idea what we're truly capable of. Colin O'Brady adopts a similar approach, not only as a professional endurance athlete and world record holder, but also as the first person to complete a solo, unassisted trip across Antarctica. I asked Colin about what experiences shaped him to become the high-achieving person he is today.
I think that I always, had a degree of confidence, but certainly I wasn't sitting around as a kid dreaming of, walking by myself for 1,000 miles across Antarctica. That came later. But I think it's built on the back of different successes, and certainly ups and downs. Also tragedy. When I was 22 years old, just graduated from college, again, still hadn't really seen much of the world at that point. And I was been painting houses as a kid. And I decided to go on a backpack trip around the world. And it was an amazing experience. I had no money. I was hitchhiking around and sleeping in youth hostels and whatnot. And I found myself on a beach in rural Thailand. And in that moment, my life changed. There was some guys jumping a flaming jump rope. I was 22 years old at the time, maybe not a fully formed prefrontal cortex. And I decided flaming jump roping looked like some fun, which it was for an instant, up until the rope wrapped around my legs, excess kerosene sprayed the length of my body and lit me on fire to my neck. And I had to jump in the ocean to extinguish the flames, which saved my life, but not before about 25% of my body was severely burned. And as a young person, it was devastating, but it was compounded by the fact that I was in the middle of nowhere. I'm in Thailand. I'm on a tiny little island. Instead of an ambulance ride, I had a moped ride down a dirt path to a one-room nursing station. And I'll never forget the 8 surgeries I underwent there. I never forget the cat running around and across my chest in this makeshift ICU. I mean, I was in a bad place. But the worst part about it, you were kind of talking about triggers of mindset and growth, which was probably the most emotionally devastating time in my life, is a doctor looks me square in the eyes and he says, "Hey, Colin, you will probably never walk again normally," which took the physical pain to another level, because the emotional devastation of that was immense. But, we're speaking of my mother and her influence on me as a young person. She came into my hospital room. She flew across the world to find me, and I'm there. I know now how freaked out she was. I'm sure many people listening are parents. She's a mother. She's looking at her kids, bandaged from the waist down in this shack of a hospital, unsanitary, screaming, writhing in pain, and being told he'll never walk again normally. But somehow she walks in with this air of positivity and grace and positive energy into that hospital room. And she says to me, "I know you're in a bad place, Colin. Like, this is horrible. Like, I'm not going to try to hide from the fear of this, but I want you to do something for me. Close your eyes and visualize yourself in the future. Picture a positive outcome. Now, your question is, I didn't picture myself, like, again, walking across Antarctica or climbing these mountains or whatnot, but I closed my eyes and I picture myself crossing the finish line of a triathlon. Which is not something I'd ever done before. I was a collegiate swimmer at Yale, so I have a swimming background, but never biked or run or anything like that competitively. And I said, look, I can see myself crossing the finish line of a triathlon. And the next moment, I think, is probably one of the most fundamental shifting moments in my entire life, because my mom had a choice. She's looking at me, she's looking at a diagnosis, she's looking at me bandaged legs, and she easily could have said, yeah, I said set a goal, but like maybe something more realistic, like you can't walk. But instead, she didn't do that. She grabbed me tight, hold me close like a mother, and she says, great, I believe in you. I believe that you're going to make that visualization a reality in your life. And, kind of fast forward, it was a few months till I was taken out of that Thai hospital. Still hadn't taken a single step, carried on and off the plane, placed in a wheelchair when I got home. And my mother, she grabbed a chair from our kitchen table and placed it one step in front of my wheelchair. And she says, look, you need to take your first step. And so it was a couple of hours staring at this chair in front of me, while from my wheelchair, legs are still kind of bleeding, bandaged, bruised, very fragile. But I took that first step. And that was when my mom said, look, you just took your first step on your road to racing this triathlon. I mean, it seems minuscule. I'm like standing from one chair to the other chair, but that was the beginning. And then 18 months later, I finally did take a job in Chicago as a commodities trader, wanted to kind of get on with my life. I signed up and raced the Chicago Triathlon, and I achieved that goal. I finished that triathlon 18 months after being told I would never walk again normally. And kind of the final exclamation point on this story is, to my complete and utter surprise, and this is your question, did I surprise myself? Well, I surprised myself that day, which was I didn't just finish the race, but I actually won the entire Chicago Triathlon, placing first out of, nearly 5,000 participants. But I mean, to conclude that thought, it wasn't like, oh, I just patted myself on the back and said, oh, wow, I'm some superhuman athlete. My mind, and this is something I think all of us can apply in our own lives, which is my mind went back to that Thai hospital and wondered what would have happened had my mom not forced me to look towards this future and set a measurable goal. And from that, I think I learned one of my life's most valuable lessons, which is not just me, but all of us, every person listening, yourself. We all have reservoirs of untapped potential to achieve extraordinary things, particularly when we can shift our mindset towards the positive and choose how to react in tough situations. And so forgive the long rambling answer. But, for me, that was a fundamental turning point where everything that I've built, that was in 2008 when I was burned, so in the last 13 years or so has been built off the back of a deep learning, something I had to learn the hard way, literally. But the strength that I've gained from overcoming that obstacle, what my mom instilled in me, and finding these reservoirs of strength and courage has definitely pushed me to do the things I've been able to do since then.
And Colin, are you finding, I'm just curious, like as you're growing a little bit older, you're married, you have children in the future, right? So are you finding, like, I'm just curious, like, how do you balance that, whether it's confidence or hubris of all the things that you've achieved, right? With whatever that next feat is, and knowing, okay, how do I approach this in a way where I've still got to make it back? Like, how do you balance that? I don't know if hubris is the word or what, but where do you find, where can you draw that line between pushing forward and pulling back?
It's a great question. I think that people oftentimes, a similar question, it's about fear or risk management or things like that. And the truth is, people say, oh God, this guy walked across Antarctica solo. He's climbed these mountains. He got in a rowboat and rowed across Drake Passage, the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the world. This guy must be an adrenaline junkie or something like that. But to be perfectly honest, I really don't see myself in that light at all. I don't think I'm chasing adrenaline like a game of Russian roulette that I hope that I keep winning. These are calculated, these are thought out, these are trained. I'm not saying there's not a risk, the risk and the tenuous nature of these is what does bring apart some of the richness of the experiences. But at the same time, I really do think them through moment to moment, step by step, day by day, and evaluate that. As I've gotten older, I don't think that I'm going to necessarily take on different projects, but I do think that there is at some point a fallacy of, look, I've said 10 world records and someone's like, oh, what's the next biggest, hardest, bigger mountain, further continent, harder way to do X, Y, or Z, like the one-upmanship of yourself. And I think, at some point that's a losing game for sure. And so, at this point, I still have all sorts of big dreams out there in the world of exploration and various ways to kind of push my body in unique and interesting ways. But it's not necessarily built on the backs of, what's the most headline catching thing? What's the hardest thing you could possibly imagine? My ego doesn't necessarily, need that. What people say, what are you afraid of? You must not have fear. And I actually have all sorts of fears. But my biggest fear is really in not living the full totality of life's experience. This may resonate with some of your audience or not, but I've come to think about life sort of on a spectrum of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst day of our entire life, and 10 being, the highest, most beautiful day, the day your first child is born, or some, really high peak moment of your life. But I think too often, certainly in Western culture, at a certain socioeconomic level, we actually end up in this zone of comfortable complacency, this zone between 4 and 6. Maybe your boss yells at you at work at one day, but you don't like your job enough. It doesn't really matter. So it's a 4, but it's definitely not a 1. You're like, whatever, I don't really like this job anyways. Or like on the weekends, you're watching a football game with your buddy, drinking a couple beers, your team wins, maybe you had $20 on the game. Oh, great. That's awesome. But that's a 6. It's not a 10. And I think too often we're stuck in this zone of comfortable complacency. So rather than thinking about 1 to 10 in a linear plane, I kind of think of it as a parabola or a pendulum swinging back and forth, which is I've realized to experience the 10s, you also need to embrace the 1s. You also need to put yourself in challenging circumstances. My solo crossing Antarctica was a beautiful experience, not because nothing bad happened, but because it was hard and it was gritty and it was tough. And I found myself at the lowest moments of my life, but because I was able to not hedge against that downside 1, but embrace those 1s, both the 1s and the 10s can come to life. And I both see them as valuable. So my biggest fear, or the way I look at risk, is actually my biggest fear is to living stuck in this zone of comfortable complacency from the 4 and 6. You got to have some 4 and 6 days. You got to transfer through theirs from time to time, but I want to live the full tapestry of life's experience. And I think that too often in our culture, life brings us to that comfortable middle, and we don't allow ourselves to take on any sort of risk, to allow ourselves to feel those peak moments of those 10s.
Of all the adventures he's undertaken, the one Colin is presently most known for is his record-setting trip across Antarctica. I asked him to elaborate on what drove him to attempt such a seemingly impossible journey.
What I was attempting to do was become the first person in history to complete a solo, so completely alone, unsupported, which means no resupplies of food or fuel. So you have to carry everything with you from your drop-off point to the end, which makes it very heavy. My sled was 375 pounds, mostly full of food. And like I said, a little bit of white gas to be able to melt snow and turn it into water, and very minimal gear because still 375 pounds. I could tell you a whole story. I could barely pull the thing when it started. Human powered. So, no dogs, or people have done some amazing crossings of the continent using kites to propel them. But my goal was kind of the most pure mano a mano way, just me, my sled, pulling, on foot, wearing skis, but just to add, not like you're skiing, just to add some stability over the snow. That's called man hauling. And so nobody in history had ever completed that crossing over the landmass of Antarctica. People had tried in the past. A few years before I went, a guy named Henry Worsley tried a very similar crossing, and he was out there for 71 days, very experienced British explorer. He's actually the grand nephew, I believe, of Ernest Shackleton, or one of the guys from Ernest Shackleton's crew, And he made it 71 days, 100 miles from the finish line of the thing, and actually got a bacterial infection and ultimately died. Another guy attempted the crossing a couple years after that, the year before I tried, and he made it, very experienced British explorer, made it 54 days into it, and ultimately ran so low on supplies and food that he had to be called to be evacuated. So, people have basically started to say, this crossing is impossible. People have tried it. The math just doesn't add up. You can't literally carry enough food with you. If you pack your sled with 1,000 pounds of food, obviously you can't pull it. If you don't bring enough food, you're going to run out and you're going to get sick and die, or, any number of things can happen. And so people said it was impossible. And my wife and I, we love to name the projects that I do, kind of brand them, but just kind of fun for us. And so we decided to call this project The Impossible First, which is also the name of my New York Times bestselling book, The Impossible First. But it wasn't because we were like, oh, people say it's impossible, in some cocky way of saying like, oh, but I'm going to prove them wrong. It was literally saying this actually might be impossible. However, I'm willing to try my very best. I'm willing to go out there. And if I fail in 50 days, I still believe there's value in trying something this hard because I'm going to learn something from it. I'm going to grow something from it. I'm going to confront those 1 days and have those 10 days all around it. Of course, I was hoping to complete it and be successful. And, ultimately I was, but it was far from a gimme. And so the impossible first, that idea is bounded upon like, hey, look, certain things might seem impossible in certain moments, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. You shouldn't take those first steps and engage that process, which is exactly what we did out there.
Man, like a worthy adversary. Like when you were going through all these different, periods of adversity, like, did you ever think, hey, this is going to make a great story one day, or were you just trying to make it through?
No, I mean, look, it's funny, throughout the entire crossing, Jen and I have, marketed and branded to some level our projects. And, we do these things where we have students, tapped in through our nonprofits. We have millions of students involved in that. And so it's, we're doing outreach and things like that. But once I go into them, I'm not like, oh, wow, who's covering this story or whatnot. And so Jenna had kept me like very insulated from all of that. Ultimately, this expedition, which I didn't know at the time, not till I was back in the United States, had garnered 2 billion media impressions. It was the most, widely covered expedition in modern history. And so, kind of a funny tangent story to that was I finally, after Lou finished, and then it took a week or so to get picked up from where we were back to this other base in Antarctica, and ultimately back to the southern tip of South America to Punta Arenas. And Jenna had flown down to meet me there, and I rush off the plane. I'm so excited to see her and jump into each other's arms. It's an incredible reunion. And one of the first things I said to her was like, I'm so excited. We get to go home tomorrow, sleep in our own bed. She'd actually got a puppy when we were out there. I can't wait to meet our new puppy, all these things. And she was like, yeah, about that. And I was like, what? And she was like, we're not flying to Portland tomorrow. We're flying to New York City, and you're going live on the Today Show like tomorrow morning. Which again, like humbled, honored, grateful for, all the interest, all the exposure. It's been a beautiful and humbling thing. But I've been alone in Antarctica for 2 months, not talking to anyone. It's completely insulated from this. She's like, you're flying to Manhattan. You're going to be on live television tomorrow. I was like, wait, what? It was a total mind warp, so to speak. But yeah, look, I think that I love storytelling, and I think that every single person has a beautiful story to tell. And I think as humans, we gain inspiration from other people's stories. And, I love sharing my story for that reason, but I love consuming. I love listening to stories. I love listening to other podcasts, movies, books. I'm an avid reader for that reason, because I believe all of us in this crazy thing we call life are experiencing it. And when we share those stories, there's a ripple effect of positivity that happens from being inspiration and ultimately lifted up by a community of folks that share their stories. And so I don't necessarily do it, quote unquote, for the story, but I've been humbled with how many people, want to hear me share the story and the success of the book and other projects that I've had. But like I said, humbled by it all, but certainly is not the driving force to create a story, so to speak, or to manufacture one. Just to live fully in my truth, and from that, I suppose, has spawned at least my authentic story of my experience and what I've taken from it.
Through commitment and perseverance, Colin achieved the impossible. But sometimes, even smaller goals require a shift in our mindsets and habits. Our next guest, behavioral economist and Wharton professor, Dr. Katy Milkman, spent years researching this very subject and reveals her findings in the best-selling book, How to Change: The Science of Getting from Where You Are to Where You Want to Be. During our conversation, Katy discussed some of the most effective goal-setting strategies.
We want to get better. That's our natural inclination, is towards improvement, which is great. You can see why that's an adaptive feature of human nature and why we would be, it would be common to want to improve. But you're right that wanting is not the same as doing. There's so many more steps. One of the things I have studied in my research is how to actually launch change. What are the ideal moments when change is most likely to happen, when we're most motivated to go beyond wanting to acting. And what my collaborators and I have found is that there are actually moments in our lives that feel like new beginnings. So the most familiar one might be New Year's, but there are others as well, from the start of a new week to the celebration of a birthday to moving into a new role at work or in your family, that they give you this sense that you've closed one chapter in your life and you're opening another, even if it's as small as a week. There's this sense of a fresh start and a clean slate that comes with it, and an identity shift, because you can say, okay, that was the old me last week or last year before my birthday that failed to achieve goals X, Y, and Z. But you get the sense that you have a clean slate and a fresh start, and the new you can do it. And so what we found in our research is that at those moments that feel like new beginnings, people are more likely to start pursuing goals. They're more likely to do things like visit the gym, search for the term diet on Google. They're more likely to set goals on popular goal setting website around everything from their finances to their education to their health. And so if we're trying to think about how do we actually move beyond just wanting to change to actually taking action on it, looking for these moments that are essentially propellants, they supercharge our motivation and make it easier for us to, jump and actually take action, can be really valuable. And when we're trying to coach someone else or encourage someone else, if you're in the role of a manager, a teacher, or literally a sports coach, looking for a fresh start moment in the life of the people you're encouraging to make change can be really valuable. We've found that when we, for instance, highlight dates on a calendar that correspond to fresh starts, like the first day of spring or a birthday, and then invite people to make change on those dates, people are more motivated and find that more attractive than if we just invite change on an ordinary moment.
And what do you find to be the difference? So, for example, on New Year's Day, tons of people setting New Year's resolutions, and the gym is never more crowded, right, than it is at the start of January.
Yes.
But then it seems like however many people set those resolutions in February, most of them seem to fall off. And I'm just curious, what's the difference between somebody who maintains that habit or builds on that habit versus the one who abandons it?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I have to say, by the way, that because I'd done this research on the fresh start effect, which is what we call this phenomenon, a lot of people, when they heard I was writing a book about behavior change, assumed I was going to write a book about fresh starts and their incredible motivational power to get us going towards change. And my immediate response was, that would be a really useless book because fresh starts only get you started and they don't get you to the finish line. So I wrote a chapter in this book about behavior change that focuses on fresh starts, but the rest of the book is about strategies that you can use now that you've got that motivation to begin to actually get further than February if it's a New Year's resolution. That is the challenge with so many goals, is that we need more than just the motivation to begin. We actually need tools and tactics to help us overcome the many barriers to change that can stand in the way of success. So there's a lot of different strategies that work. And a key lesson I've learned in my research is that it really depends what barrier you're facing to change, what internal barrier, I should say. I focus in my research on studying the internal barriers. There are, of course, many external barriers that can get in our way of change, from, whether or not you have the financial resources you need, the structure in your environment that you need. Those are all worth attention too. But there's also internal barriers that can be obstacles to change, from hating the process and finding it deeply unenjoyable, to old habits, to forgetfulness, to lack of confidence. And depending on what that barrier is, there's a different set of tools that research suggests can be helpful. And if you apply the wrong tools, you don't get nearly as far. So I'm sure we're going to dig into a bunch of those. Let me just sort of high level say for now that the tactics depend on what is holding you back. And so a really important part of the process in planning how are you going to get from your New Year's resolution to lasting change is starting to diagnose, okay, why is it that I am not exercising regularly, or I'm not hitting my deadlines at work, I'm not eating the way I want to be eating, or practicing meditation at the rate I want to be practicing it. Whatever your goal is, it's really important to interrogate those obstacles that are holding you back first.
And I don't know if you've heard this expression, but we're all committed to our existing set of habits. So there's sometimes there's good habits and bad habits, right? So for some people, I'll just give an example. At 5 o'clock, they're lined up at the gym. And for others, at 5 o'clock, they're lined up at the liquor store, right? Both habits that take place at 5 o'clock. And when you mentioned that, like, our existing habits at times lead us to live on autopilot. So when we are changing behavior, how much of it is like replacing another habit versus just creating a new one?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it certainly depends a lot on your circumstances and probably your age. And, I know we both have kids, and that's a whole other thing that shapes and constrains habits and routines. So, that's a big old, it depends. Actually, the best tools and tactics for building new positive habits are, I think, the same in both cases, whether we're replacing old ones or building new ones. It is key in sort of habit startup mode to try to first, create a plan. When is it that you want to execute the behavior? Not just what is it that you hope to achieve or what's your long run goal, but can you break it down and think about what exactly do you need to do, say, on a daily basis? When will you do it? How will you do it? What will your social supports look like? And then really is true that the more you practice something, the more it becomes habitual. And we think about practice and deliberate practice as something you do to achieve mastery, which is absolutely true, right? If you want to be a great basketball player, you have to shoot, thousands and thousands of basketballs. And if you want to become a great pianist, you have to practice over and over again and get that feedback. It turns out that building habits, though, is also about repetition. And so if there's something you want to do that's good for you in the long run, trying to think of it as something you want to practice, just like you'd practice the piano, doing it in an ideally a somewhat structured and consistent way, though also building flexibility so that you have sort of a backup plan if you can't do it in exactly the same way at the same time every day. Do you have, what's the second best, and practice that as well, and try to reward yourself for that practice, because rewards are what makes habits sticky. Once you repeat the behavior and you see that reward, you see the good outcome. And maybe, by the way, a lot of the things that have long-term rewards, we need to bring those rewards forward by making it fun or telling other people about our successes so they can celebrate with us, tracking them in some way. Those things are going to help us build lasting positive habits. So repetition, reward, some degree of consistency, but also enough flexibility so that when life throws you a curveball, you will still be able to enact that habit. Not always 7 a.m. or always 5 p.m. is if you get too rigid, actually my research has shown you don't build the most lasting habits. So some degree of flexibility is important to build in as you're in startup mode.
Our behavior can be greatly influenced by those around us. In fact, Katy believes that the closer we are to someone with a situation that resembles our own, the more likely we are to be influenced by them. I asked Katy to speak to the impact communities and other external influences can make on behavioral change.
It might be the most important factor. And one of the things that's tough is it's one of the more difficult factors to change, right? Because we don't choose our community always. Often it chooses us. There's a huge influence that social forces play on our ability to achieve our goals. The people who we surround ourselves with show us what's possible. They give us hints as to what we can do to achieve similar objectives in life. And so to the extent that you can actually craft a community of like-minded individuals, that you can build groups that you socialize with intentionally who have similar goals and shared aspirations, is really, really valuable. It's a reason, frankly, that so many of the organizations built around behavior change, from religious organizations to organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous or WW, formerly known as Weight Watchers, they recognize this, and groups are such a huge part of the techniques they use to help us get to our end objectives. But you can do this deliberately in your own life and recognize if you can form a group of people with similar goals, whether it's people who want to run a marathon or people who have similar business objectives, spending time with those people, learning their tactics. I often talk about the power of forming an advice club can be really useful because you see what works for other people who are similar in various ways in terms of their objectives and ideally their background and skills. And you can copy and paste what's working for them and start learning it and using it yourself. But another feature of sort of an advice club where you have a group of like-minded people, you seek advice, you see what's working for them, ask what I should do in this situation, is actually when you get asked for input, when someone comes to you and says, what would you do in this situation? That turns out to be incredibly valuable for your own outcomes. So being put in the role of advice giver boosts your confidence that you actually know more than maybe you realized. It makes you feel like, I can do this if someone's coming to me and looking to me for wisdom. It causes you to dredge up insights that you might not otherwise, because now to help someone else, you have to figure this out. And then once you've advised someone else to take a set of actions, you're more likely to follow through on them yourself because you don't want to be hypocritical. And so social groups that have similar goals give you the opportunity to be in the role of advice giver and role model, which benefits you just as watching others succeed benefits you. So there's all these powerful ways that groups can shape our outcomes for the better. They can also, of course, shape our outcomes for the worse, which is why curating them carefully can be a huge asset.
Look, I'll be honest, I don't have a great transition here, but let's revisit our episode with Sean Claggett, renowned trial attorney and founding partner of Claggett & Sykes. So as a result of his numerous 6, 7, and 8-figure verdicts, Sean has become an influential voice in the legal industry and takes on the difficult cases that most attorneys pass on. I asked Sean to elaborate on his approach to leadership.
It's funny, I teach law practice management at the law school at UNLV. And I had a guest speaker last week who was a very prominent med mal defense guy who I have a lot of respect for and is very, very good. He's a formidable opponent here in town. And his perception of me was that I work 25 to 35 hours a week and I make $20 to $30 million a year. I'm like, man, that must be really awful to believe that. Because that would be very frustrating, wouldn't it? If that was true. And as we're going through, I explained, it's weird, but, I still, I work a ton. And at my office, there's not any position in the office. I don't care if it's the receptionist, the runner, file clerk, paralegal, legal assistant. I've done every job in this firm out of necessity when I was building it. And so you lead by doing what needs to be done. And, people look at your work ethic. They really do. If you're the partner in your firm who's basically packed it in and shows up 15, 20 hours a week, do you really think your staff's working hard? You're the example. You're the leader. People see me working. I'm almost always the last one to leave. I'm not usually the first one here because I got to take my kids to school. But I'm always one of the last ones to leave. And a good short day is 12 hours. And so I think when people see that, they understand that what we do takes time. And you want to be great at it, then you got to spend time being great at it. These trial lawyers that people see that have all this success, they're completely misled. And, and I'm going to use Joe Freed as an example. Everybody hears Joe Freed's short trial, like his speed trial, right? Oh, that's perfect. Look, you can get it done and get all $20 million in 2 days. They have no idea how much time Joe puts in to condense a trial like that. That is one of the greatest skills anybody I've ever seen in my life. I mean, Joe Freed is amazing. But the misconception is that it's easy to do that and that the lazy lawyer is thinking, oh, I don't have to work as hard. I can just get this done and it'll be simple. And that's just, it's not true. Doing what we do, the great lawyers, all the great lawyers I know, Brian Panish, Mark Lanier, Joe Freed, any of those guys, Alex Alvarez, Bob Kelly, it doesn't matter. You go around the country, they all work their asses off and they know the cases better than everybody else because they've spent more time with it, And so I think that common trait is shared between successful leaders, and all those guys look at their firms. They have very successful firms.
And Sean, I'm glad you went there because I want to dig in deeper to that, because for people listening, it's important to really talk about the process, because from the outside, I don't know that everybody sees it. Like Joe Freed, who you mentioned, when he was on the podcast, I'd ask him, hey Joe, what did it take to become the nation's preeminent trucking lawyer? And he said, well, all I did was just give a presentation. I spoke to lawyers on trucking every week for 10 years straight. Every single week for 10 years straight. And when you hear this and again, you hear about like the commitment necessary, the process that's involved. What do you believe makes for a great trial lawyer? Because I've heard you say things like sometimes it's charisma, sometimes it's preparation. What are some of the things you think make for a great trial lawyer?
Right. Well, that's a really good question. I've given this a lot of thought actually over the years because I've taught a lot of people. And there's some people that just have, I call it. They have it. And just because they have it doesn't mean they're going to be a great trial lawyer. It just means they have a more likely potential to be a great trial lawyer. So I think there's individuals that just have a natural charisma, that people are drawn to them. And they have that personality that people want to be around them. But to be a great trial lawyer, you can't just have that. You have to be extremely detail-oriented to the facts of your case. You have to know all the facts of your case, because as a plaintiff lawyer, we only have one chip. and it's a poker term. You got a chip in a chair. Well, you push that chip in, you're all in. When you go to trial, you're all in on your first chip. And it's the credibility chip. And if you lie or you misrepresent one time, you're done. I mean, that jury's going to hold it against you, and it's bad news. And a lot of the times, not all the times, a lot of the times, it's lack of preparation that creates the appearance of dishonesty and lack of being trustworthy. Because you say something that you don't know for a fact to be true. And so we spend a ton of time with my office making sure the attorneys know you have to know everything. And that means it requires you to go through every single document. Any document that's in that pretrial disclosure that the plaintiff or defendant may use, you better understand what's in it. And it takes time. You actually have to read it. I can't tell you how many times. I do a lot of consulting. So my days are spent either doing trial, prepping for trial, or consulting other attorneys for trial. That's every day, 5 to 6 days a week, 12 hours minimum a day. That's what I do. I can't tell you how many times attorneys come in and they have no idea about the facts of their case. They're completely unprepared, and they're coming to us to help them. And I'm like, how do you expect us to help you if you don't even know your facts of your case? And it happens all the time, and it becomes something that is explainable. And here's probably the biggest thing to being a great trial lawyer: reduce the number of cases you have. Most plaintiff lawyers have way too many cases in litigation. Our firm averages about 8 cases per lawyer, which is about all a lawyer can really do. You get to 10, 12, you're pushing it. The average plaintiff firm, their litigation attorneys have 50, 100, 150 cases in lit. Good luck. I mean, which of those 150 clients are you going to not screw? 2, 3 of them maybe? The rest of them, you're just like, oh, well, sorry about that. We couldn't actually dig in on your case. It's really an unfair thing to do to those clients. So that's the other thing. I think what makes a great trial lawyer, have the time to spend on it. And then something that's really important that I preach to my own attorneys and all my law students is, as a lawyer, you are a commodity, period. Don't kid yourself. You can invest in yourself as a commodity, or you cannot. And I use the analogy of, imagine a kid that grows up playing golf. And he works every day. He goes out on the range every day, and he practices. And then he goes into high school, and he does well, but he practices. Then he gets a full ride to college and continues to practice. And then he finally gets his PGA card. He gets his ticket. He's like, man, I made it. And then he stops practicing. And a year or 2 later, he loses his card, and he's out, and everybody says, what a waste of talent. Well, that example, you're like, no, who would do that? That's crazy. Well, 95% of all lawyers do that. It's exactly what they do. They get their license, and then they take CLEs that aren't meaningful, don't improve themselves, and they're 10 years in, and candidly, they are slightly better than they were 10 years ago, but not substantively better at any real skill set. And so that's a problem. And so invest in yourself as a commodity, I think, is a huge reality that lawyers need to accept. When you do that, you start to become a great lawyer, because as you're learning from other great lawyers, you'll see, hey, that might work for me. That might work for me. And you start putting together a tool chest that has all these different tools, and some of them will work for you. Some of them, they just won't. They don't fit your personality. And so you end up in a position where you become a better trial lawyer. And then the last thing I will say, as to become a great trial lawyer, you got to do focus groups. You got to do lots of focus groups. We don't get into trial nearly enough today to be effective trial lawyers without focus groups. Our firm does probably 200 focus groups a year, 4 or 5 a week. I myself do about 100 focus groups a year. I've done over 800 of them over the years. So that's a really critical thing, because when you do those focus groups, what's fascinating is the unintended consequence of focus groups is you become really, really good in front of a jury, because you necessarily have to, because that's what you're doing. Every focus group you do is like a new panel walking in. And as you do more of them, you become more comfortable, you become authentic. And if you're authentic, your charisma shows. And if you have good charisma and you're authentic, you are trustworthy. If people trust you, you do better.
Sean's approach to engaging with and influencing a jury can go beyond the courtroom. Speaking of influence, our next guest quite literally wrote the book on it. Dr. Vanessa Bonds is a social psychologist, professor of organizational behavior at Cornell University, and the best-selling author of You Have More Influence Than You Think: How We Underestimate Our Power of Persuasion and Why It Matters.
There are so many books out there on how to gain influence. And, there's all these sort of instructions and tips and tricks and, things you can do better. And it's funny because that message never sort of jived with what I saw as a social psychologist. As a social psychologist who studied influence for over 15 years, I am constantly seeing how much influence people have without even trying, just by being around another person, just by making sort of a throwaway comment, and just by people sort of noticing them and mimicking them. And so it's always been interesting to me that there's such a sort of appetite for these books and seminars on gaining influence, when in fact it seemed to me like, we all have it. So why aren't we seeing it? And so the book is really kind of laying out all these psychological biases that prevent us from seeing the influence that we already have and thinking that we need all these tricks and tips.
And in the first chapter of the book, I know you talk about unseen influence, basically stating that we're not as invisible as we think. If you could elaborate on that, and then as you describe, like the invisibility cloak illusion.
Sure. So this is a finding by my colleague, Erica Boothby, who's this amazing researcher at Wharton. And she has coined this phrase, invisibility cloak illusion, which basically refers to the idea that as we walk through the world, kind of just going about our ordinary day, you can imagine yourself walking through the park with headphones on, or, sitting on the subway, reading a paper. We think that no one's really paying that much attention to us. Right. So we think that we're essentially walking around in an invisibility cloak. And what she's shown is that, in fact, more people are noticing you and noticing the things you're doing, the things you're wearing, your behaviors, than we tend to think. So when she's asked people, how many people were looking at you in this particular scene or in this particular moment, people underestimate the number of eyes that were on them. And that's partly because when we catch someone's eye, we have this thing called gaze aversion, where we quickly look away. And our assumption is that, they caught me looking at them. But she shows that actually, it's just as likely that you caught them looking at you, but we tend to assume it was the other way around.
And I love how throughout this book, it's almost like this: whatever you believe, consider the opposite, because then you juxtapose this with the spotlight effect and then the reverse spotlight effect, if you could kind of differentiate between the two.
That's right. So a lot of people, once they first hear about the invisibility cloak illusion, get very paranoid and self-conscious, because they think about all the times that they really were hoping nobody noticed something that they did. And they don't want to hear that, oh, wait a minute, lots of people saw that. And in fact, that is called the spotlight effect. And that is another phenomenon that was done by a colleague of mine here at Cornell, Tom Gilovich. And that's actually a happier sort of story than we may initially think. So the spotlight effect basically says that we think more people are watching us than actually are, when it's about something that we are acutely self-conscious about. So for example, if you're having a really bad hair day, if you feel really self-conscious about some style you're trying on, if you stumble and say the wrong word, if you just do something embarrassing as you're walking around, fewer people are noticing that and seeing that and remembering that than we tend to think. So he looked at this in the context of giving people these embarrassing t-shirts to wear. And he gave them these Barry Manilow concert t-shirts, which now I'm like, that would be a really cool hip thing to wear. But he pre-tested it back then and found that most people were pretty embarrassed to be wearing this Barry Manilow t-shirt. And he led them into a room with a group of people and then took them out of the room and said, how many people in that room do you think noticed what was on your t-shirt? And then he asked the actual people in the room, how many of you noticed what was on that participant's t-shirt? And on average, people tended to overestimate the number of people who were paying attention to that embarrassing thing on their t-shirt. And so you could say, like, how do we reconcile that with what you just told me about the invisibility cloak illusion? And the idea is that when we're kind of going about our ordinary life and not acutely self-conscious about something, then we feel more visible than we actually are. But when we're super self-conscious or embarrassed about something, then we think all eyes are on us, and that's not necessarily true. And so Erica Boothby actually teased these two things out by giving people either a new t-shirt, an embarrassing t-shirt like Tom Givlich did, or had them wear their just ordinary t-shirt that they came into a study wearing. And she found that if you were just wearing your ordinary clothes, you thought no one really noticed what you were wearing. If you were given this embarrassing outfit to wear, you thought everyone noticed, right? And they were both errors. So it winds up being this kind of happy medium where you have more impact because people notice the things you do more, but it's not the things that you're worried about people noticing.
And those in power, you argue, they don't oftentimes like bow down to the same kind of like social pressures and concerns that you kind of discuss throughout the book. Why is that?
That's right. So there's some interesting psychological effects of having power that have been documented. And a couple of them are, for one, people in positions of power tend to be less likely to take other people's perspectives. And when you think about that, it's really just a matter of practical concern, right? If I control the resources, as I said, that's how they define power, right? I don't need to figure out so much what motivates other people because I'm the one who has the resources. If you're in a low power position, you really want to understand like what motivates that higher power person so that you can find a way to get access to those resources. But if I'm in a high position of power and I make a comment and it, hurts someone's feelings, it doesn't matter as much if I am in a lower power position and I hurt a higher power position's feelings. And so we're less likely to sort of take people's perspective, and that makes us less worried about saying things, blurting things out, how our words might impact other people. And another aspect of that is that we tend to experience fewer situational constraints. And so there's a classic study where people who are primed to feel power, they do that by just having you remember a time that you were in a position of power. They were sitting in a chair and there was a fan blowing on them and it was really annoying. And it was ambiguous whether you were allowed to move that fan. And people in positions of power would just go ahead and move it. Right? People who had recalled this time that they had power. People who recalled the time they didn't have power would just sit there and kind of deal with the fan because it was ambiguous. They weren't sure if they could do that. And so people in positions of power kind of feel like they don't have to worry so much about what other people think. They don't have these situational constraints. And in the end, what happens is they extend that to their impressions of other people. And if someone else doesn't move that fan, they're like, why did you just sit there? Right? Why didn't you move that fan? And forget that not everyone is lacking in those constraints.
Yes, I want to elaborate on this because, the leaders those that have power, I think that sometimes this false belief that, well, we may be free to do what we want to do, that others are also similarly free. And that I think can cause a lot of blame and so on. Like, how would you suggest leaders navigate that?
That's right. And it's interesting because, as I said, you kind of overextend that feeling that I don't have these constraints to other people not having those constraints. And so there's some interesting research by Pam Smith and her colleagues looking at how if I'm in a position of power and I'm assessing whether someone who was late to a meeting because they got stuck in traffic is responsible for being late to that meeting, people in positions of power are more likely to say, yeah, that's your fault and your responsibility. The situation that you had no control over, right? A traffic jam. But if I'm in a position of power, I just assume like you can handle a situation. You don't have these situational constraints. I'm going to blame you for being late for something you couldn't have actually, prevented. And people in positions of low power are more likely to say, okay, that was a situational constraint. They couldn't have done anything about that. And so one thing is just to be aware of that. Right? To sort of know that that is a bias that we tend to have when we're in positions of power, that we over sort of attribute agency to people who might not always have agency. And then also to sort of try more actively to take the perspectives, or we could talk later about the difference between taking perspectives or getting the perspective of other people, but really to try to get insight into other people's constraints, other people's concerns, other people's reactions to things we say and situations that they're in, and sort of recognize that when we're trying actively to figure that stuff out, we're often wrong because we're basing it on our privileged position of being in power, right? And so we often make these mistakes trying to understand what someone else is experiencing in that situation.
So I read something interesting. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. And someone was saying essentially that those that are in power, for them, when they are vulnerable or they exude vulnerability, that actually is seen as a leadership strength, and it builds connections and it creates more authenticity. But someone who is not in a position of power, when they are vulnerable, it comes across as weakness. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that from an influence perspective?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, if you're in a position of power, people are looking to you. You control their resources, their outcomes, and they want to know that you're going to do it in a way where you're actually taking their outcomes, into consideration. And one big worry about power is that people are so focused on enriching themselves and maintaining their own power that they're not actually thinking about the people who, they're in charge of. And so there's a big difference in the research between people who think about power in terms of opportunity and think about, again, how they can enrich themselves, they can maintain power, the opportunities that come with having power, even if that's, shaping the direction of your company, right? Which is a great positive thing, but that's an opportunity. And then there are people who think more about the responsibility that comes with power, that whatever decisions I make in terms of shaping the direction of my company, all these other people's outcomes are going to be impacted by that. And I think, as you're saying, when you're in a position of power and you show this kind of vulnerability, it kind of suggests that I am willing to kind of think about you and care. And it suggests that there's going to be this sort of pro-social understanding and responsibility that you're taking for other people's outcomes, and this awareness that your power has this element of responsibility as well.
I want to give a huge thank you to every single guest who's joined me on this season of the Game Changing Attorney Podcast. And I want to thank you, yes, you, for listening to this podcast and your commitment to learning and growing as a leader. You've been listening to the Game Changing Attorney Podcast with me, Michael Mogul. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you can leave a review and share this podcast with at least one other ambitious law firm owner. And you know what? Maybe more than one. For more information on this episode, see the show notes in your podcast app or visit GameChangingAttorney.com. And join us next season as the Game Changing Attorney Podcast returns in January with an incredible new lineup of market leaders and experts from the legal industry and beyond. We'll see you in a few weeks.